So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vishal, the founder and CEO of Ventry, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. So the session will be recorded and shared later on the website so that people who couldn't make it can access it over the next coming days. Now, by default, everyone joining will be put on mute to avoid any distractions. For questions, comments, please use the chat feature on Microsoft Teams. Now, I would like to begin particularly by thanking everyone for taking the time to be with us, especially the presenters and the effort that has gone in over the last few weeks to put the webinar together. As a team, and that's being Ventry's first webinar, focused on the renewable sector, we are incredibly humbled by the diversity of the audience today, dialing in from all the way from Australia to Japan, India, Africa, Europe, and especially the US. I know that it's been pretty much, early, very late in the evening for our friends and colleagues dialing in from Australia to all the way very early, especially for people dialing in from the US, especially the West Coast. So we have over 105 registered users, at least as of 10 o'clock this morning today, and representing nearly 75 companies from nearly 20 plus countries. So this attendance, it simply validates, our vision or Ventry's vision towards the renewable sector, and that's really making spare parts management smarter and leaner for the overall industry. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate that. Now, with regards to the agenda for today, we have a pretty packed agenda. So I'd really appreciate your support if you do go over a bit in you taking the time to stay on with us and also ask a lot of engaging questions, because that's ultimately what this is about. So with regards to the contents, I will start with a brief presentation just about Ventry, just spend a couple of minutes for those of you that are not aware of who we are and what we do. But then hand it over very quickly to Tim and then to Harry and Carlo, who will be sharing their expertise from spare parts management. We know that we have several participants dialing in from the wind sector or the storage industry as well. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be sharing today also applies for the wind and the storage industry. Okay, we started Ventry with a very clear mission, and that's we want to make sure that we are able to digitize how spare parts are managed within the renewables industry. Now, we literally bumped into this sector by accident, and then it just made a lot of sense. So what has happened over the last years, especially the last 5 to 10 years, the solar industry has exploded. We all know that. Now, but also what has happened as a result is that most of us as asset managers or O&M managers, we have suddenly had to deal with a lot of spare parts in the field that is being held. And that's pretty much being done using rudimentary tools like Excel or Google Sheets or even pen and paper. And that literally has led to very little digitization, ultimately resulting into poor visibility and also us getting into issues around high cost of operation, high wastage, all sorts of things, ultimately resulting into margin erosion. So that's why we created and developed Ventry, which is basically a smart, intuitive solution that pretty much can be deployed across PV sites, whether it's remote sites, whether it's central locations where you store equipment, parts, everything from transformers, inverters, you name it, and also works around subcontractors that you might be using, and can work as a standalone or as an integrated solution into your ERP or CRM solutions or CMMS solutions that you might have in place today. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Tim.
My name is Tim Harman. I have a background in civil engineering and project management. I've been engaged in the solar space for the past 20 years, covering rooftops, mega solar in Asia Pacific. Possibly my greatest achievement is off-grid systems in schools in Africa. There's a lot you can learn by taking solar to a small place in Africa, particularly about the parts you take, the reliability, and zero access to spare parts that you haven't taken with you. So some of these things are a discipline that teach you lessons in life. First of all, to be really clear, there's some kind of debate on what is a spare part. Is a fuse a spare part? Is it consumable? O&M contractors and owners discuss this because a consumable is included in the contract, a spare part isn't. From our perspective, all parts need to be documented. A system can fail for want of a fuse if we don't know where that fuse is. And therefore the debate on whether it's a consumable or a spare part becomes irrelevant. So looking at this first graph, this is where the industry is right now. There's not just in solar, in lots of areas, there's a huge drive to reduce operational costs. For some reason, O&M is an easy target. It doesn't really produce a product. And it's an area where they think we can just reduce the number of inspections, reduce the preventative maintenance. So if we reduce the amount of preventative maintenance, we see an increase in corrective maintenance. And somewhere in the middle is this optimum, which is where O&M managers are trying to get. And part of that strategy is looking at what I think of as the low-lying fruit. What can we optimize easily to get us down there? And one of the things we can look at is spare parts. Next slide. And so this is a typical cycle after an incident, which we see. We are aiming at this 99% availability. We have an incident. That incident gets reported. Then there's an action stage. We correct it if it's required and report that back to stakeholders. So this happens at a local level. It's reported at a monthly and annual basis, but the information is very much localized. Next slide. And where we want to get into is this continual improvement cycle. This allows us to reduce and optimize the costs. And in order to get that, what we need is information, so that when an incident happens, we can investigate that incident and particularly the parts that were involved. We can learn, we can share that information, and then proactively escalate that across the number of plants. So if we have a particular plant with, say, SMA inverters, for example, or TMEC, doesn't really matter, and we see there's a couple of them have problems with overheating and heat exchangers, what we want to do is have access to that data centrally to say there's a potential pattern here. Now we can look at other projects that have similar systems and watch that equipment more closely. One of the downsides of preventative maintenance is it's very almost agricultural in its approach. It relies on periodic inspections, monthly or 6-monthly inspections, and statistical expectation that components will fail, and that will mitigate that if we do an inspection. And it's very hands-on. It's literally look at the component, even the smell you'll see documented as one of the key things to check for. There's very little technology involved in there. And when you look at the incidents that are happening, that are being recorded, they don't necessarily correlate with the preventative maintenance that we're doing. Next slide. And so there's several strategies that we're all aware of. Preventative maintenance, this is what I've just discussed, very organic, very hands-on. Condition-based maintenance, this is definitely the way the industry is going, where we're paying more attention to what's actually happening to the components. We've seen it with drone surveys through thermal imaging. In fact, you can do thermal imaging of inverters and various other components to try and get their condition and do the maintenance based on the condition, rather than the preventative maintenance. I've seen preventative maintenance schedules which include inspecting all the junction boxes behind modules. And yet if a module fails, that's not going to impact the plant. If a string fails, that isn't really going to impact the plant. If a heat exchanger fails, that could reduce the efficiency of the inverter by, say, 25%. So what should I be spending my time on? I should be spending my time more on condition-based maintenance and maybe save some of that money from preventative maintenance. Underpinning all these are spare parts availability. No matter how I find the problem, I still need those spare parts. If those spare parts aren't available to me, then that can cause dead days or even months in availability. Quite possibly those spare parts might be available within the fleet, but again, because it's a localized thing, we tend to look, have we got one in the warehouse where we are? No, we haven't. Therefore, we go back to the manufacturer and order the part. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. And so in accepting that we need to take ownership of the spare parts and build a strategy, what should we be looking at in terms of our strategy? One of the key things I'm going to talk about in several slides is ownership. Ownership of a data set is really important. If nobody owns the data, nobody is accountable for it. And therefore, nobody's monitoring or reporting on the accuracy of that data. It's something that has to be provided in monthly or annual reports. There needs to be a spare parts inventory, but nobody generally goes back and compares that, say, with what the manufacturer's recommendation spare parts, or even look back and say which components failed the most and which ones do we need. And we don't particularly need a component, say, like an MC4 connector. Most sites have a few hundred MC4 connectors that I can get from Amazon within 20 days. And again, an MC4 connector isn't going to impact on my plant. Then this is the management of the centralized data, which we can then use for predictive maintenance and a dynamic response in extreme weather. If we have a plant that's hit by a lightning strike, it could be all the STPs in a particular zone need to be replaced very quickly. We haven't got enough in spare parts, therefore we go through the process of ordering them. If we had a more intelligent system, we could just step back and say which other sites have spare STPs that I can very quickly get to this site to get this site back up and running. Another key area is data collection and analysis to analyze and look for failure patterns. And this comes back to ownership. If someone's responsible for that data and for reporting it, then they can also look for trends and patterns. And that also can be done automatically. It's not a complex bit of code to have a system that looks for anomalies in the actual data set. We also tend to find that lots of spare parts are procured locally. The O&M provider will do it, of course, because they get a 15 or 10, 20% markup on those spare parts. So they're not exactly motivated to find the cheapest spare parts. And so having a centralized management of those can reduce cost as well. There's also the management of component warranties and the shelf life. Lots of components, the warranty starts from when they leave the factory, not from when they're installed. And so you can have a component, would say a 5-year warranty that's been installed for 6 years. So when you install it, it actually has no warranty at all. So part of this is analysing the criticality of the spare parts that you have and the risk of non-availability, which is measured in terms of the cost of energy, the lead time, and the mean time between failure. And if you do that analysis, you'll find you need more inverter components than you do solar modules, for example. Next slide. Next slide. And so this is the scenario we typically see, which I just described earlier, which is islands of each particular plant has its own warehouse with spare parts, and they have an inventory, which can be, as was discussed in the previous presentation, it can be a spreadsheet, it can be a PDF, like you see every form. It will be in a document that is easily accessible. Islands of information are quite common in all data sets, and cloud computing has kind of reduced this and bringing information into a central data. Next slide. Okay, so centralizing this data allows us then to have access at a helicopter view. So if we're looking for spare parts, we look outside to the OEM or to the O&M provider. We can actually look and say, what stock do we have in our own business? Equally, if we have some components which are quite expensive, but they are common to several plants, but perhaps with a low failure rate, it becomes more practical to have one of those that is in a particular warehouse but centrally accessible if we need to replace it. Next slide. Next slide. That's it. So I'm a project manager, so I wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't briefly discuss. What we tend to do with spare parts is we transfer that risk. We transfer that risk to the O&M contractor, who will have a line in their contract which says manage spare parts. In most cases, there's not too much detail about what exactly is involved in managing spare parts, but generally it is interpreted as keep spare parts according to the original list and report on the quantity and the quantity used. It's important to note that if the spare parts aren't in the initial operating list spare parts list, it's an operator non-liability event. It means that the owner is responsible. So the owner has a vested interest in making sure they have the correct spare parts on site. If they haven't, the O&M provider will obtain those spare parts. They're not liable for any delays. It's not a win for the actual owner. The other problem I have with transferring that risk is the intelligence that we learn from spare parts failing, the actual mean time between failures, which can be very site specific, is never centralized. But we don't analyze that in a central basis, again, to learn from that knowledge and allow us to be more predictive in our maintenance. And as we heard earlier, the maintenance is becoming more predictive and with more technology coming in place. So my thought is that we should mitigate that and take ownership of the spare parts, which means, as I've shown there, shifting that spare parts availability and management back onto the owner's side to manage. Next slide. And so I put slide up here. This is a made up spare parts list from a monthly report, but it is typical of what you see. There are no spare part numbers, very little reference. It just says a control board, and there's two of them. We don't know which control board it is, or even if it's the correct control board for that inverter. A bad situation would be if the inventor has a control board, and then when we go to fit that control board, we realize that for whatever reason, it's the wrong one. That's because the data set has never been validated. We've never digitized that information and cross-referenced it against the manufacturer's recommendations. And so the key questions we should ask ourselves for our inventory is the inventory accessible? When I say accessible, I mean, can I, from an office in Madrid, see what the inventories being held are like in Japan, for example? So is it centrally managed? Is it complete and accurate? And this is my point earlier. If we know the part numbers and the manufacturer and the suppliers, then we have enough information to be able to replace that part. Do we have the manufacturer's recommended spare parts? Has anybody cross-referenced that against the inverter and say, have they got the correct spare parts? Are they proportionate? And by that, do I need 1,000 MC4 connectors on a project? But clearly I don't. How many solar modules should I have on the actual project? Is the number of spare parts correct? Are they required? This is a key question. Do you actually need those spare parts? If we look at spare part availability and the impact on the project, then some standard products, again, going back to connectors or fuses, we don't necessarily need to have those on site because the impact, if one of them goes, is very low and I can very easily get them. So why do I keep a huge stock of those things? Is the supplier high risk? This is quite interesting because the businesses we're in are very volatile. So companies change hands quite frequently. So if I have a particular SCADA system on my project, for example, are those spare parts, which may well be very specific to that company, are they always going to be there? Is the company going to be there? So that the risk assessment of spare parts helps me decide which parts I should have. Other spare parts considerations are availability, which is what I just discussed. The lead time to replace, how long to get a spare part. If it's 1 or 2 months or 6 months, that should be a factor. What's the supplier? Is there an alternative? Are they critical for reactive repairs? And what's the risk of not having them? And the key thing is, what is the cost? So very rarely on a spare parts list do you actually see a cost. So centrally, an organization has no idea how much money is wrapped up in spare parts. And the other key thing you see a lot of is the mean time between failures. So the mean time between failures is normally given out by the inverter manufacturer, for example. However, there's always a little clause which says, depending on site conditions. And so the mean time between failure may be different for your particular installation, but your maintenance contract is based on the fact that they say every 5 years you need to replace this component. If we're in a situation where the humidity or the heat is such that it's a cooling component, maybe it's every 2.5 years we have to replace that component. if we're not managing our data, we can't actually pick up these trends. And so digitizing that data and having automated analysis of the data is a real step or a milestone towards preventative maintenance. Corrective maintenance, sorry. Just to sort of recap on the two main themes there is the ownership. A lack of clarity about who owns data means that many people within an organization understand the information exists at the local level. They know it's on a report somewhere, but no one's responsible for the overall accuracy in reporting. And so it's really important in an organization to identify ownership for critical things. We accept spare parts are critical to the functioning and the maintenance and the availability. Someone should own that. Whereas, as I mentioned before, it tends to just be in a monthly or an annual report, which maybe is managed by asset management, and there's no real ownership because we've mitigated or transferred that risk onto the O&M provider. The importance of spare parts inventory management, I've listed a few details here, is that spare part access across the fleet. So if we lose a control board, we haven't got to go back to the OEM. The first place we can go is where else in the fleet can I find a replacement? So it could be I can have a control board on site within a day rather than waiting 3 weeks for my OEM to provide the replacement spare parts. We can optimize the spare part quantities. If we have expensive spare parts and we have a common type of unit, then we can reduce the number of spare parts that we actually have, which reduces the cost. We can calculate out the mean time between failures for particular components, so we get real-time data towards our maintenance. And we can look at the reorder threshold. We can reorder threshold is how many spare parts do I need to keep on site or in stock before I need to reorder more. And finally, in there is warranty management. So management, some components are failing in the warranty period, and the management of that, which again is generally handed over to the O&M provider, is something that can be easily built into a more efficient spare parts management system. Next slide. So in summing up, this is what we promised at the beginning is the 5 most important factors in the strategy. Sorry, my son. So the first one I've got down here is to own your spare parts, which means own the data. Don't transfer the risk to the operator. Spare part non-availability is an owner responsibility, not an operator liability. And not having the correct spare parts reduces availability and increases corrective maintenance cost. Validate the spare parts list. Spare parts are critical to your business availability. Standardize the data format across the fleet. That means have the same spare parts lists across all sites, have a common data format in the reports. Critically analyze what spare parts you keep. Prioritize, value the spare parts inventory. Make someone corporately accountable for the spare parts acquisition and logistics. Report to stakeholders on the global position, not just the local position. And value the cost of the inventory and the cost of not having correct spare parts. Don't rely on the operator's monthly reports. The other thing important is to analyze your data. Data is a valuable resource. You know, you're reading more and more about big data. Well, you can start collecting this data right now with spare parts. Use the data for condition-based maintenance. Run automated exception reports to identify trends and proactively respond. So these are all things that can be done with very little capital investment. Whereas normal condition-based maintenance is, as I mentioned, it's the way the industry is going, but it has this expensive startup because you need to install sensors and various technology around the plant. This approach with spare parts is a very easy milestone because it gives us this data. We can only get this data if we have a centralized management system. So centralize your spare parts management, break down the silos and the islands of information so you can adopt this helicopter view of spare parts and optimize spare part availability across the fleet, minimize the stock of high cost, low failure probability items. And finally, I put one here is digitize, digitize, digitize. This information, there's a lot of important information that's wrapped up in data sets that we can't actually access. Once that's digitized, once we know we have the right spare parts, what that part number is, then we can start to optimize how many spare parts we have across a project, which would reduce the cost. And as I mentioned before, is a real stepping stone in the way of in the path to condition-based maintenance.
Cool. Thank you, Tim. So Harry, over to you.
Okay. Good. Hi, everybody. My name is Harry Wolkenfelt. I'm the CEO and founder of Solarif Group, a Dutch-based company, independent insurance company, and with about 13 years of experience in the solar business at the moment. And it's the only thing we do. We're 100% focused on ensuring PV systems and assuring quality. So what we do, we're active worldwide, and inside Europe, we mainly focus on all sizes of installations, and outside Europe, we focus on projects 25 megawatt or bigger. We have offices in Australia and in the Philippines. And the Solarif Group has insured at this moment a little bit more than 2.5 gigawatt in portfolio, and the departments with whom we are working are Solarif Insurance, where we do the insurance of the PV installations, Solarif Risk Management, where we do the assurance of the quality of products and work, and Solarif Matchmaker, which is like a real estate agency, but then we don't do real estate, we intermediate on PV installations worldwide. So that's the introduction of Solarif Group. When we go into spare parts for us, that's the second thing. We first start with looking at the quality of the products, and that's why we also have an inspection department. And what kind of risk are there, and how can you mitigate that kind of risk? And spare part management is one of the areas where you can mitigate the risk. When we go into what kind of risk do we see, and what kind of risk do we have when it's regarding spare parts, and how big is it, then we would first look at, for example, the panels, where we have concerns and problems or claims in case of insurance coming from frame, from backsheet, delamination, glue, hotspots caused by soldering. Hotspots could also be caused by microcracks during transportation or construction, but that's not in the factory, it's outside. And then loopholes in the quality control processes. Where we see the defects of modules, which could be between 3 and 5%, which has a huge effect on the performance of the installations. So that's based on numbers which we received from SunCycle. But in fact, what we see is here, and that's the same for the string inverters, that the problems appear in the first, let's say, 2-3 years, and then you have a certain period of less problems, unless, for example, the delamination process that takes a little bit more time and often comes up in, let's say, the 4th, 5th year of operation. When we go into the string inverters, then on the next sheet we will see we'll dig into that more into the problems of the string inverters. But it's even worse if you compare it with the panel. Then the string inverters are giving more problems, and because of that, claims for the insurance side, where we are taking the risk on behalf of our insurers. On the central inverters and transformers, it's less. But what you can see here, the number of claims is less, but the claim itself is much bigger. So and that's with the inverters. You have a huge amount of claims, also with a big impact, where the panels have, let's say, less claims, but also a bigger impact on let's say the number, the amount of claims being paid and the amount of money being paid. Well, the central inverters, of course, have when a central inverter goes down, then a big part of the system is not working, which has a huge impact compared with the string inverters. So for us, more and more we prefer the string inverters instead of the central inverters, just from a risk management point of view, and the claims being less than when there's a central inverter down. The business interruption because of that is much higher. Vishal, can you go to the next?
Yes. Tim, I think your audio issue should be sorted out.
One back, please.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. The inverters, what we've been seeing now is that 60% of the failures could be related to the inverters, and that could impact your yield up to 30%. These are numbers which just came out by a white paper from Kiwa together with PVL, and which is a really interesting white paper to read. Just came out last week, where the root cause is often in what we have seen is not only the quality of the panel of the inverters, but also the poor workmanship, firmware which has challenges, poor O&M and monitoring. So these are the aspects of what is the reason, what is the cause of these defects, which follows for us in increasing in for the O&M parties, increasing OPEX costs and underperforming, but also for us, it's a problem on the side of business interruption, where if we have covered the inherent defects or the manufacturer's defect of the product itself as a claim, as a covered event, then for us as an insurer, the problem is in the form of replacement, which would often be a warranty issue, but the consequential losses being business interruption due to the problem, to the issue, and warrant under the warranty, but the panel manufacturer or the inverter company is not paying the business interruption. That's where we have to pay for the business interruption, and so that's the concerns on the OPEX side, concerns on the insurance side, and the way forward is to mitigate that risk as much as possible. And the way to do that is by inspections, pre-shipment inspections, product qualification programs being in place, technical advisory about are we using the right inverters, which choices do we have to make depending on location, depending on humidity, depending on the type of installation. And then once it's done and it's shipped and it's there and it's working, you have your site inspections, which could be visual inspections or inspections through drones. And then you have, of course, your preventive, not corrective, but preventive O&M and monitoring of the systems to make sure that you can signal problems in an early stage and take action, and again reducing the risk on behalf of the insurer in that way. So Vishal, can you give to the next one? Yeah, risk, no, one back. Yeah, mitigation. Well, how to do that? That's through focus on quality. As I started this my talk, how to do that? That could be as a totally inspection of the factory, which or going on batch level or on inverter level in the factory itself, during production or just after production. Could also be done, for example, with panels after the shipment and on the park itself with mobile lab. During construction, what's supervision there to assure that the work is done properly, and the technical commissioning inspection with, well, drones and infrared cameras. Once that is done, then there's, let's say, focus on let's say repair and replacement time. So it's a really important point to figure out how fast can I get my spare parts. Do I have to have a certain amount of spare parts to reduce the time of that the installation is not working? Can I do that by having a certain amount of spare parts on location, or do I have it at a central point, or do I don't have it at all? I have to purchase it again and have it shipped from China, for example, to the US or to Europe. How much time does it take? What's delivering time? And that you also have to take consideration of the location. You might be in remote area where you have to cross rivers in Africa, and during a certain period of 2 or 3 months, there is no possibility of coming there with the trucks. So that's where the concerns are from an insurance point of view. Like, okay, how much time does it need to get the system up and running again? And then, let's say, managing your spare parts, having spare parts on site or at a warehouse in the neighborhood makes sense for us to mitigate that risk, so that the cost of business interruption decreases or is managed as good as possible. The next one, insurance. So where does the business interruption, or where does when there's an issue with repair or replacement, there are typical insurances for solar world is where the construction or risk insurance, that's a delay in startup, often caused by a natural disaster. The operational risk, which covers the property damage of an installation, or the inherent defect, let's say the manufacturer's defect, in case something goes wrong with a product, but which was created in the factory, but appears during operational phase. In both cases, material damage or inherent defect could cause an interruption, a business interruption, and that's a consequential loss of your material damage. And that is part of an operational or risk insurance if you have taken such an insurance out, that part. So that's where the insurer will look at, like, okay, what kind of mitigation risk measures have you taken to reduce the risk of a huge amount of business interruption being paid as result of a material damage. And then the other one is a performance guarantee insurance, where the insurance guarantees the output from the system. And you can imagine that also there, if the insurer is taking over and guaranteeing the return on a system, downtime of the system is an important thing. He also wants that to be as low as possible, and spare parts is a huge, can make a huge difference in having it up and running within your, let's say, your deductible. In case of business interruption, that's waiting days. So is the system up and running within the number of waiting days? It will not cost the insurer any money, but every day after the waiting days, if the system is still not up and running, it will cost the insurer money because he has to pay for the business interruption. So also in this case, the performance guarantee, it's really important that the downtime is as less as possible. So.
Okay, cool. So thank you, Harry. I really appreciate that. So there are questions coming in already. So my suggestion here for people asking the questions is that what we will do is we will start compiling the questions to the end of the presentation, where we have allocated about 10 minutes. And that's where we start addressing the questions. So I'm just taking some notes here for questions coming in. And of course, if it's a risk-related or insurance-related topic, it's very clear that it's for Harry. So just in the interest of time, I'm just making some changes. So we keep the Q&As for later. So please keep the questions coming. By no means that should be a deterrent to asking questions. So I see questions coming in again as well for you. So we're just putting them, I'm just taking note of them. And then we move to Carlo, and then we come back to the Q&A session.
I'll keep the presentation to around 5 minutes, so we'll make sure we get time to for the Q&A as I see the questions coming in. Just a brief introduction. My name is Carlo Godschalk. I work for DHL, and within DHL, I look after a business, or actually a product that we have. We see it as a separate business, an aftermarket service logistics. So what we are doing is we are serving customers and helping them to fulfill their aftermarket needs. Typically, this is based on a network where you have spare parts which need to deliver to customers within 2 and 4 hours. And we are very heavy in the technology sector. So in today's a couple of slides I wanted to share with you what we have seen in that sector, because the problems that I've been hearing, those are the problems that our customers had 10, 15 years ago. So hopefully you don't have to look for invent the wheel again, basically. So this is our network. So globally we have over 1,000 warehouses or field stocking locations where we ensure that the critical spare parts are close to the install bases. We have the luxury to do everything on one operating system. And it comes back to the point that Tim had on making sure your data is aligned, so you can compare and you can control it. That master data is extremely important and get the visibility in. So without further ado, let's look at the next slide, Michelle, if you can. So what we've seen over the last, I think you just probably need to do a click, an animation in there, I guess, just click through. What we have seen over the last 25 years, and we've been working, just go one
Carlo,
back.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So the typical service logistics ecosystem that we are seeing all the way comes from the manufacturer. And then, we typically have 3 types of warehouses, where you have the big central warehouse, then you have an in-country warehouse or a regional warehouse. And what we're talking about here is really more those field stocking locations, right? So to ensure you have got those critical parts close to the install base. Now, that's where we have a lot of learnings with a lot of our customers, because when we started this business 20 years ago, let's make sure we have every single part available close to the install base, right? Let's make sure that we have everything there just in case. There was no control, because what most important was uptime, and mitigate all risks when it comes down to disruption, because this business was growing, right? So it's top line focus, not so much a focus on rationalization and the bottom line focus. So what we then saw over time, when the technology sector and and typically the computing sector started to mature, get stable, and we started to optimize and rationalize. And then questions are being asked, okay, where do I need to have my spare parts? Which spare parts are critical? Which spare parts should I have, close to the plant? Which spare parts I can store centrally because they're not that critical? And those questions are really, we started to work together with our customers over the last 10 years to really get that visibility to answer those questions, because what is key here is the visibility. Right. So if you don't have, you can't manage what you can't measure in that sense. So what we have seen main challenges in the sector over the last 20 years is, first of all, a limited visibility of the inventory in the field. So we had, a lot of our customers had not really an idea where the inventory was. Was the inventory still with the engineer? Was it in the field? What was the state of the inventory? What was it a good part, a bad part? And then the entire reverse process as well was pretty much not visible. So the two main focus areas that we have seen over the last 10 years working with all these technology customers is that, when you provide visibility, that's the only way you can start managing that end-to-end supply chain. But you need to start having a baseline first. So if you go to the next slide, Vishal, it's a bit of a case study that I wanted to share with one of our customers. That one of their main challenges was lack of visibility. Customer came to us and said, listen, we have all these install bases out there. We have a good profitable business where we sell aftermarket service contracts to our customers, but we're getting under cost pressure. The market is getting more and more mature. We don't know which parts we have out there. Can you help us? So the first thing we started to do there is really focus on the visibility, making sure, and for this customer, we were, I think, over 140 countries. We had presence, we had inventory there. So it's a huge project, of course, to combine everything and to digitize everything. So what we've put in place there is kind of a central control tower, one single IT system, so one single system for the customer to see all their inventory wherever it was. And only once you have that visibility, we're starting doing modeling and say, well, those spare parts haven't really moved over there. And by the way, they are supporting not the mainframe, but the sub part of the mainframe. So even if that mainframe is not working optimum, it can work, in a 90% way. So you don't really have to have that part close. So let's all source them back and put them in a central warehouse. And if we need to deliver them, we can deliver them next day, right? So instead of having all this capital deployed. So we've
Carlo,
actually managed to.
Maybe if I can just actually add some background information for the listeners on our webinar today. Sure. Actually, most people might be familiar. Of course, everybody's familiar with Oracle, but everybody knows Oracle as a software company. So I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is Oracle actually what is Carlo talking about from a supply chain perspective? So this is actually the Sun Microsystems acquisition that was done by Oracle a couple of decades, I think a decade ago. So maybe that's just some background. So we're not talking about software. We're talking about networking and server racks, stuff like that. So which is pretty critical components to keep data centers running.
Absolutely, the high-end storage, yes, correct.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michel.
Sure.
So we've obviously seen the benefits with these customers, and we managed over time to really optimize their stocks positioning. And still now, after 15 years working with this customer, we still do revisions every single 6 months, and we still work with them to ensure that we have the parts in the right place. Just conscious of time.
There is one thing actually, sorry, if we can just go over, I think, there's one thing I would like to add actually, and building on what Carlo was suggesting here today, is that I know that a lot of our listeners and attendees joining in are all the way from NovaSource, which is a massive, massive global company, very active in the US, several gigawatts under management, all the way down to customers who have maybe 50 sites or 60 sites within a country. So what we are talking about today is, and what Carlo was actually referring to, is that I know that not a lot of the companies here are active as Oracle or Sun Microsystems, but actually the rules of engagement and the best practices are actually very much applicable, whether you're managing 50 sites within a country, 50 sites within a region, or 1,000 sites within a country as big as the United States or Australia. Cool.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Carlo.
Yeah. No, that's perfect, and you're absolutely spot on, right? Because the principles are exactly the same. Right? The 5+1 rules, basically, that Tim explained, they are very valid for large multinational companies as well as smaller companies. So just a couple of things where we think, we're in the aftermarket scope when we talk about solar, where there are some similarities. And where when you provide visibility, when you digitize what you're going to get, now for sure you're going to get a reduction of your non-critical inventory on site, because I'm pretty sure that if you have no visibility today and you let the service organization or the commercial organization sometimes drive those decisions, then you will probably have a lot of spares on site which are not really critical, they don't have to be there, which result into consolidating of inventory at more strategic locations. Which really allows you to focus on the critical parts management. So which parts are really critical and which ones do I really need to deserve my attention. And of course, there's a solution as well for managing unmanned storage in remote areas. So there's a lot of parts out there in the field that are stored, almost like a shed or a locker. And not in all the 1,000 sites that we have actually somebody on site. So there's also a technology element in there that we're able to provide visibility on those parts, even if those parts are just stored remotely. And what key is there is better visibility of the supply chain, the movements and the inventory levels, and where possible as well, better alignment on the SLA. Right, because not every part deserves the same SLA. Certain parts you can just ship out next business day, or you can ship out within 2 days or 3 days, or even perhaps longer. But some specific parts you really need to make sure you have them in a 2 or 4 hour. That's typically our sweet spot of those deliveries. So, happy to receive any questions or engage further as well. But from our kind of dipping our toes in the water in this sector, we see a lot of problems that we have already solved for customers, specifically in the technology sector. So
thanks Carlo.
2 minutes left, Vishal, so I want to
thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's fantastic that we were able to get through all the slides within time. So just looking at the questions coming in, so I think there's one coming in from Lindsay here, based out of the US. So she says, for Carlo, curious if there's a max on storage time you can hold. Also, there are any options for parts that might need maintenance. So I don't know if you have access to the questions, Carlo, coming in.
Yes, I can see the question. Yeah.
Okay.
The max storage time, there's no max storage time you can hold. Parts, of course, when you talk about, I'm not sure if it's available here, when you talk about batteries, of course, you have expiration times, and we have to then manage those. When we talk about dangerous goods, when we talk about holding inventory. And also, are there any options for parts that might need maintenance? Yes, there are multiple ways of, if that's what the question you're referring to, when you have parts coming back and that need a bit of a screening or need maintenance or doing maintenance on site, that is a service as well that we provide.
Interestingly enough, actually, Lindsay, we were asked, I was on a call with someone else this morning, and one of the questions that came up was return and reverse logistics. So just to give you an example, one of the services that DHL actually does have is return logistics. Now, this might not be something very commonly used within the solar industry or the PV industry, but something that has been very common within the high-tech enterprise computing is having a very streamlined reverse logistics and return logistics process as well. So today, for instance, let's say if you're using an SMA inverter or a TMEC inverter that Tim was referring to, one of the things or the benefits of the digitization process is that if you do have a digital tool, let's say that you deploy to manage your inventory out in the field, one of the next steps right after that through that digitization process is the ability to not just streamline your procurement process or utilization process, but also your reverse logistics process, where you could potentially have two choices. One is send back if it's within warranty, of course, you send it back to, let's say, SMA or TMEC for repairs. Then they send it back to you, and that entire process can be automated. That's one option. The second option is that you send it for repair, and you might want to restock it at a different location once it's repaired, to make sure that you have an optimized stock count across your sites. That's the second option. And the third option is the potential to basically offload it from your inventory and ultimately from your P&L. So that could mean putting it on a secondary market for sale. through services and partners like Second Soul, who's actually also on the call with us, that have a massive network of secondary, that have a massive secondary market available out there. So those are the kind of possibilities that are out there, and I'm sure there are more. The second question coming in was from Siddharth, so he's still online, which is, have you done I think this, Tim, this came in when you were presenting, and that was, have you done a cost-benefit case study on a plant using a tool versus B plant without using, and I suppose he's referring to an inventory management, like a spare parts management solution. Tim, you're on mute.
That's it. The simple answer is no, we haven't. It's something that we're currently looking at doing. But some of these things are quite self-evident. What I do know is that it's very frustrating when you try and collect spare parts information. If you've got 30 or 40 projects and each one is in a different format, that data is clearly not accessible. And so if you centralize that data to look for commonalities and reduction of spare parts, it should be self-evident that it will be an advantage. I mean, this is, I think, what Carl was just talking about earlier on. The industry used to be that they just had loads of spare parts. It's a kind of organic approach, even down to connectors, everything, keep them all locally. But now with centralized data, in lots of other industries, when they've gone down this path, the cost benefits have been self-evident.
Yeah, I think if I could just further build on to that, Siddharth's question there is, let's take an example of a customer having 100 locations or 100 sites in Spain. And then next door, that customer, the same customer also owns, the same asset owner also owns sites in let's say, Portugal, maybe 50 sites. So I think if we could expand that particular question to saying, okay, you've digitized, let's say, the north of Spain, you might actually end up with a massive gap in information for the south of Spain or the rest of Spain. And the same applies if the entire Spanish portfolio was digitized from a spare parts perspective. You could be able to geographically share some some equipment between different SPVs that exist between Spain and Portugal. So those are the kind of benefits you would have. So indeed, I think building on your point, Tim, let's say, we've seen case studies where a portfolio, an asset manager could have the advantage of sharing even a transformer between multiple countries or within a country, where we know that the backlog for ordering transformers can be anywhere from 6 months to a year. So especially if you have a site which has gone down where and you do hold a transformer in stock, it might not be the perfectly configured transformer for that particular location. So just for the sake of an example, if you have a 5 megawatt site going down, you could still end up bringing a 2.5 megawatt transformer to that location, and let's say curb or let's say reduce the revenue loss for a short period of time, at least until you have a replacement transformer in place on that site. So those are the kind of value propositions that digitization can offer. There's one question that came in, and that is, hi, can you elaborate on what type of KPIs you would apply when assessing the quality of a spare stock, if possible, other inventory accuracy and turnover rate? I think, Tim, this is perhaps directed towards you. And Carlo, but feel free to step in as well if you'd like to add something there.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of a conversation I had with Carlo last week where DHL were talking about that one of the key KPIs is how quickly do you want the spare part. One of the things we talked about is the lead-in period. Depending when you do a criticality analysis of a particular spare part, this dictates the KPI in terms of how quickly do I need it for site. If the impact of that spare part is relatively low, like a solar module, then 1 or 2 weeks KPI for having that site is quite acceptable. If it's an inverter component and its criticality is high, then that would be stored in a place where we could, or where DHL could get it to the site within a reasonable agreed time. There's a logistics exercise there, so perhaps Carlo could fill in, because I know you shared some KPI figures on delivery for spare parts.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's typically where we start with customers to understand, the install base. What are your contracts? What's the criticality of the parts, and that kind of defines a very dynamic mapping, right? And it's important that the service levels and the criticality of the parts actually drives the network, and not just loading up the network with parts all over the place. And then by digitizing it, you can actually repeat that exercise, every single 3 months, every single 6 months.
Okay, cool, thank you. So there was another question that came in a bit earlier. I think that was the first question coming in from Siddharth as well, who's still online. And that was, I think, directed towards Harry. What about insurance on radiation or wind? Harry, I'm not quite familiar with that question, but maybe if you could, if you already got that.
Yeah. It's possible. It's called a lack of sun. So if the radiation is not as expected, that it would not be a material damage, but you still have a business interruption damage, and because the radiation was not as high as you thought it would be, and so there are possibilities on the insurance side to cover that kind of risk. What you normally see is that on the insurance side of lack of radiation, lack of sun, in the solar area, it's not often purchased by clients because the volatility of a lack of sun is low compared with wind, for example. Mm-hmm. So in the wind sector, there's the same. There is a cover available to cover the lack of wind. Compared with the assumptions you took into your model.
Okay, cool. So I think I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you once again so much for your time and the efforts, and thank you to our audience for dialing in. And if there are any questions, just drop me an email. You have my email address.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.